Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this HidMed Chat, a pandemic update to review the Pfizer vaccine approval for adolescents and to talk about getting kids back to school in the fall. My name is Dr. Neecey Hudson, Chair and Science Director of Hood Medicine Initiative.
And I'm Jonathan White, co-founder and director of policy.
I'm Doug Slaughter, the Public Health Director.
HidMed Initiative is a collective of scientists, physicians, hackers, and assorted geeks focused on addressing health disparities and improving access to care in Black and Brown communities.
And our HoodMed Chats, our signature event, is an effort to bring expertise of healthcare professionals and others to our communities. Our goal is very simple: help us, save us.
Today, we are happy to welcome back Dr. Eric Yancey, a dear part of our Gorilla family. Dr. Yancey is a dedicated pediatrician who has been practicing in the inner city of Indianapolis, Indiana for over 30 years. He began his practice as a resident in the newborn intensive care unit at Indiana University Medical Center at the James Whitcomb Riley Hospital for Children. And he was the first African-American resident at that hospital. He was named Chief Resident of Pediatrics in 1979, and he is currently the Adjunct Clinical Assistant Professor of Pediatrics at Indiana University School of Medicine and a fierce advocate for the health and wellness of his community. Welcome back, Dr. Yancey.
Thank you. Thank you. Good to be here.
And we also have Dr. Keli-Koran Luchey with us tonight. Dr. Lucci is a crisis counselor at Sweet Home Schools in Amherst, New York. And she's also the CEO and founder of Lucid Pathways. It's an educational consulting, life coaching, and personal consulting firm. She has a BA in psychology and women's studies from SUNY Buffalo, which is where she completed her Master's of Education in college student counseling and personnel services, and a PhD in counselor education. She also has an MS in educational administration and is a supervisor from Canisius College. So we're so glad to have you, Dr. Lucci.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Dr. Yancey, welcome back. As I've told you many times, you are America's pediatrician to me, and I'm so glad to have you back here. How have things been in your practice, your pediatric practice, since the kids' announcement? Have there been many inquiries about the vaccine? And what's the perception of how Black parents are looking at the vaccine and getting their kids vaccinated?
Yes, there's been. First thing I'm going to throw in, and because I forgot to change my bio, that I now can say I've been practicing for more than 40 years.
Nice.
Hey, yes.
30 years, so now but I up to 40 something.
No, legit. He was my pediatrician, and now he's my children's pediatrician. Yeah.
So so the perception has been, I would say, mixed. Okay, now I'm a fierce advocate for it, but I've had it kind of go both ways. Some of the parents are still a bit hesitant about getting it and about getting it for their children. And I still think a part of it is some of the misinformation that they've heard. And one day I'm going to have to figure a way where I can be believed as much as Instagram posts, okay, but that's still maybe a ways off. But there's some that have been very receptive to it, and some that have still expressed a pretty good bit of hesitancy. Now, when I try to pin down what that hesitancy is, they really can't give me a good idea of why they're hesitant. They're just hesitant. So I think that we still have some work to do so far as some convincing and proving that it's safe. Keep in mind that clinical trials were one thing, but now we have hundreds of thousands of doses,
millions
in the post. And so we can still. It's like now we're just doing mega million trials, okay, and that we're doing all these, and so we're looking at these things. So it's still being looked at all the time. So I try to convince parents that the trials didn't stop when the vaccine, administration started. They continue on, and I think we may be making some headway, but we still have a ways to go.
Yeah.
Dr. Lucci, can you tell us about your work a little bit and your perception of how the pandemic has affected school children and how they've been coping?
Oh boy, absolutely. So prior to serving as a crisis counselor, I was actually an administrator for 3 years. And I switched over, transitioned so I could care for my father who has polio. And I just needed to be more available. And I'm so glad that I listened to the Lord speak to me because he's not able to walk anymore. So he definitely needs more of my attention and my brother's. But with that said, working more directly with students as the crisis counselor, I am seeing the direct impact that COVID has on all of our students. The school district of which I work, Sweet Home, is a first ring school. So it's right outside of, the urban settings such as the Buffalo Public School System. But we have a very diverse population in terms of ethnicity and race, socioeconomic needs, and the mental health needs of our students has been, it has magnified tremendously. It has brought greater attention to those students who already had pre-existing struggles. And then certainly we've had a large volume of students who did not struggle with mental health. But as a result of COVID and the impact that it's had, not just in terms of health, but in terms of, the income, the social impact that it's had. We keep saying, social distancing, and I cringe every time because it's really not what we're looking for. We need physical distancing, but we really, truly need to really push for the social interaction with our students. And I'm sure for those of you who have children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, that so many of our young people have been kind of pushed into playing video games. Even those students who never pushed, or never engaged in video games are doing it much more, especially when we were on the lockdown. That was their only way of interacting between that and social media. So the mental health needs of our students, it's alarming. And I'm really hoping that our country, the nation will really take heed to that and really allocate funds so that we can provide the supports to our students and to our families.
Since the announcement of the FDA EUA and the CDC approval of the Pfizer vaccine for kids aged 12 to 15, there have been a lot of relieved parents, but also, as you mentioned, Dr. Yancey, some parents with many questions and concerns about the vaccine safety for children. So Dr. Yancey, can you help us understand the importance of vaccination in our communities to protect children and keep them safe?
Yes, and let me just get to this. I would say that, of course, not having met Dr. Keli-Koran Luchey, I didn't know her story. And so I didn't know until just now, seconds ago, that she's caring for her father, okay, who had polio, okay? So polio. So that's something that many people listening to the program can't really relate to.
Yeah.
And the reason you can't relate to it is because in 1955, we started vaccinating for polio, okay? Mm-hmm. And so now, generations from now, they don't have to be in that position to care for someone who got polio, okay? Because we vaccinate for it. Now, there were hiccups in that vaccine. And I know I'm getting off point a little bit, but I'm gonna get back to it. But there were hiccups in that vaccine. There was a batch of them that was really bad, and a number of children that it was not adequately, denatured, and so therefore a number of kids got polio, and the parents stood in those lines. Even though that happened, they stood in those lines and said, "I want my child vaccinated for polio." Just this past Sunday, I posted something on my professional page that talked about that. You could see the effects of polio. You could see people that were crippled and couldn't walk. You could see the iron lungs of children that couldn't breathe. You could see the crutches. You could see the braces. And it was devastating. People said, "Oh my goodness, I got to get my child protected." So they lined up to get those. The devastating problem with COVID is that we can't see it right now. You see people and then they said, "Well, I bet it's happening," but you can't see it right now. And so we therefore run into situations where people become not as afraid of it, or not as it's not as impactful as it should be, because they can't see what's happening right now. But what I can tell you, it's a disease that causes, and I'm going to just keep this on a level, for a listening audience, of vasculitis, and that is basically your blood vessels get inflamed. Well, everything we have has blood vessels. Your brain has blood vessels, your kidneys, your liver, everything has blood vessels. And so therefore, if these things are inflamed to that degree, they are being potentially damaged. So we're going to be looking at complications to COVID infections down the road that we didn't know were coming, because the kids got it. Everybody thought, oh, I can't see anything. It's okay. But we're getting cognitive problems that are now going on. We're getting, other things that are going on because the kids are still becoming infected. And so we have to do like they did in 1955 and say, we need to wipe this out. And that's what we're going to. Now, what I've done on that little tirade is I have completely forgotten the original question. Okay.
Actually, it kind of leads us into the question that we have from the audience, which is about the younger children, and that let's see, like the ones that are like 2 to 12, they're anticipating those submissions for September, right? But they're in trials right now. Right. They're actually doing trials right now from 2 to 11, but like they've separated into toddlers and then like the younger children, and then they've got infants that'll probably come online first quarter. So the question is that I know children under 12 are not yet eligible for the vaccine. What are your feelings about those students going back to school in person, especially schools that have optional mask requirements? What a wonderful question, Stephanie. And that's the crux of the issue, especially in our communities, which are more vulnerable. What do you think, Dr. Yancey?
Well, I think number one, let's go to, I think I totally oppose getting rid of the mask requirements, okay? Because I oppose that. I think that you're just saying, let's just throw them all back. So you have potentially asymptomatic spreaders in a situation where some of the children are going to be infected, okay? And they're going to be. It's not a matter of if they do, they're going to be. Now, thankfully, because of the most likely the lessened amount of ACE, receptors and things like that, they probably won't get as sick. But it keeps it circulating. And so now the virus will have a nice pool of people to circulate through where it can potentially mutate. So I disagree with getting rid of those guidelines and the stress of the mask, because one thing about it, variant or not, it's been shown that the masks do work in decreasing the amount of spread. No question about that. So whatever kind of variant you come up with, the mask still works in that respect. But the fact that the younger children are still going to be quite vulnerable. They're going to be able to still take it home, take it to caregivers and things like that. So I think that it is, I think that was a premature move to say, to get rid of the masking situation until the children are better covered and immunized. Now, hopefully we can get enough uptake in that 12 to 18 year group that we actually decrease the numbers down even more. But I think it's one of those things where we're going to find out that it probably was a premature thing to do.
Yeah, and also, people have to realize 5 to 12 is a much, much larger segment of the children in school population than 12 to 15.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And go ahead, Dr. Yancey.
And if you watch 6 and 7 year olds, okay, you may get a little bit of hand coverage from the 12 to 15 year old when they cough and sneeze. 6 and 7 year old, no, it's just going right in your face. That's what they're going to do. That's right. It's like, what are we talking about? And so, I think it prolongs things. They're talking September, October. It could be a little later. It may be a little later than they're talking, because for the much younger children, they're going to have to they can't just kind of take the trials from where they are. They've got to start almost back to phase 1 trials again, because now you got to look at various doses and things like that.
Yeah, they're in the dosing trials right now. As we speak.
They're big as adults, so it's like, okay, but when you're talking like a 20-pounder or something like that, you got to start back from the beginning and work up from there. So it's going to take a while. but I think that we are decreasing the amount of protection that could be there by getting rid of the mask.
I would certainly agree with that. The CDC guidelines that were recently released, one of the exceptions, and I don't know how many people that saw the headlines saw what the exceptions were. One of the exceptions is that in school settings, their recommendation was that their masking recommendations remain unchanged, right? So it doesn't matter if you're vaccinated, unvaccinated, your mom and them vaccinated, whomever, their recommendation was that you stay the course. And, anecdotally, I've seen even over the past, 7 days or so, official recommendations come out from various counties and, boards of public education boards saying, per the new CDC recommendations, vaccinated adults do not need to wear masks, so on and so forth. And so you have parents and some administrators and some teachers that are saying, well, the CDC said such, but maybe they didn't read the fine print or what have you. And so you do have a lot of confusion. But my personal recommendation is that just keep your mask on for right now, okay? Whether you're vaccinated or unvaccinated, because why would we not, out of an abundance of caution, want to protect not just ourselves, but our children? Because as Dr. Yancey has said, so many times before, kids are getting COVID and are very sick, can get very sick from COVID, and some have died from COVID. And so that's my personal recommendation, and I hope that it's heeded. But there is a lot of confusion because of the discrepancy across settings, that this new guideline applies to. So my personal recommendation is keep it simple. And
let's be clear, Doug, your recommendation isn't divergent from the CDC guidelines. The CDC guidelines are a minimum. Based on science, we know that, for adults and people who are vaccinated, it's fairly safe. That's not to say that even though you're safe, you still can't protect yourself and protect others, even more, right? So it's not like you're saying something that is going against the guidelines. You're just saying continue to protect yourself and others as long as we can.
Our one of our Hood Medicine advisory board members, Dr. Quinn Shipley, would like to point out that the recent CDC guideline recommendation is to continue masking for children 12 to 11 since they're not in the vaccination eligibility pool. But specifically where we're talking about different school districts and things and different, regulations and guidelines that may be at a state or a local level. It's important that, we just make sure that whatever is out there, just know that we need to be 5 times as careful as what's out there because we're dying 5 times as much as the rest of them.
Absolutely.
That's all. Thanks, Quinn.
And the other piece I just want to add this is we're not machines, okay? So you can't just turn on a dime, right? There's a process, to understanding, what changes need to happen in behaviors and, reconciling that with what you believe and what you understand and so many different things. And so, that's why I think it makes sense to be safe, to be smart, to wear a mask.
Dr. Lucci, as Dr. Yancey pointed out, 2 things. 1, none of us knew that your dad had polio. And 2, polio was actually a topic of conversation when we usually get together and was probably the foundation of a lot of our conversations about the importance of vaccinations because, as most of us know, barely any of us know anybody who's had polio. And as Dr. Yancey pointed out, that's because of the excellent way in which we vaccinated most of America when the polio virus was at its worst. Can you talk to us a little bit about what it's like caring for a family member and a loved one with polio? And then Dr. Yancey, can you chime in and talk about, how having a vaccine like polio has saved millions of people from having to go through what Dr. Luchey is dealing with now with her dad?
Certainly. So my father was born in 1937. He came down with polio in 1939. He is the second eldest of 5 children. He was in the hospital for 2 years. So, when I was born and just growing up, I always knew my father's arm was different, meaning his arm was about the size of my forearm. But that's it. But I never, ever looked at him as having a handicap because he never treated himself as having we never used that word. My father taught me how to drive, how to play basketball, how to pitch a baseball. Everything. He did show me how to do everything. So I used to speak in terms of the past when I would say, oh, my dad had polio. It was not until about maybe 10 years ago when my mom, who she was a retired educator, administrator, but she was also a registered nurse. And I think even to her surprise, when the doctor started talking to her about my dad and how polio was starting to awaken, it's like, wait, what do you mean? So it's, I sometimes still fumble over the word when I say my father has polio. But as you all know, in science, it's a virus that lives in the spine. Correct me if I'm wrong. And it just started awakening. And so over the last about 10 years, my father's legs started getting weaker. And then in the last 2 years, he was falling regularly. And it was, as soon as COVID hit, he started falling more. And I noticed some things, like grandpa always sitting in the same chair. Sometimes it's not because it's their favorite chair. He couldn't move. And one day, I think it was in June, he called and just said, I need to talk to you. And he said, I can't walk. I can't. So, he ended up falling, and he's a very prideful man. My mom passed away suddenly 4 years ago with a massive heart attack. So my father, surprisingly, he handled that very well. But he had been crawling up the stairs and at least, 18 stairs, at least once, twice a day, because he did not want us to move him. He wanted to keep independent, or as independent as he could. But he ended up falling and was on the floor for 18 hours in August. When he finally got to the phone and called, it broke my heart to have to call an ambulance, because what I did grow up understanding is my father suffered from severe PTSD from being in the hospital for 2 years. Growing up in poverty, my grandparents didn't have money to go back and forth to the hospital. They didn't have a car. So they would go weeks at a time where he didn't see anyone. So for all those reasons, it was extremely hard for me, but I had to call an ambulance. He was hospitalized. By the grace of God, he never broke anything. He never hit his head. And then he went to a rehab center for about 6 weeks to determine what kind of rehabilitation could be done. And then it was just determined that, the polio was just going to continuously get worse. So my brother stepped in and said he's coming with me, because I had already talked it over with my husband and my son. My dad was coming with us. So he's with my brother, but, he can't walk. Well, he can move, but he can't walk. And it's hard, because as I see him from day to day, I really see his muscles and his legs really, really breaking down. So he needs even assistance to go to the bathroom. So with that said, as scary as it was for me with COVID and, hearing, the history of science and what has happened to us and our people, did I do my research and education? Absolutely. But I am vaccinated. Now I'm going to say this, my father, who is 83 years old and sits in front of the television all day, I agree with Dr. Yancey. Our media has tremendous influence on our young people, but also our elders. My father, up until today, this is God, was anti-vaccine. He kept saying to me, Kelly, I don't have the symptoms. And I'm like, Daddy, you don't understand. You don't want the symptoms, because his arms are so weak now. He cannot even sit himself up. And I kept pleading with him. I said, Daddy, if you get that, you cannot sit yourself up, to cough. Today he called me and said he wants to get the vaccine. So I'm so happy. So tomorrow we are going to find some place to take him so that he can get them.
Good.
I love it.
Good. If I may just chime in, I mean, that's both an inspirational and a heartbreaking story all in one. Okay, and not a story, but a truth all in one. But I wanted to just go back to something you said. You said he was born in 1937, okay, and came down with polio in 1939. So all the way up until the vaccine came out in 1955, first doses being given, people were still getting polio, okay? Which means that there was no massive naturally acquired herd immunity. Okay, so we went from
Come on, Dr. Yancey.
That's a great point.
Wow.
So,
Does anybody see where he's going with it, though?
so I always like to used to tell my Sunday school class, stop me when I start lying. Okay, but we went from 1937 at his birth, 2 years later, 39, he got polio.
Yes.
Kids were still getting polio up until 1955. Okay, so where is the naturally acquired herd immunity? Okay, so these things circulate, and they keep circulating because they can always find a new host. Okay, and so if they can find a novel, unvaccinated host, then they got a place to go. Once they could no longer find that host, not because of the natural infection, but because of the immunization, they couldn't find the host, and now it didn't went away. The virus says, I ain't got nowhere to go. Now, the other thing that people don't understand, like you mentioned about the persistence of it, we know viruses today that stay around forever. HPV can rear itself back up decades later. Okay.
Chickenpox.
Why do we give a varicella vaccine to older people? Because zoster can pop back up, after laying dormant for decades. So we know these things can occur. So we have to get the children in a position to block this stuff in the first place, because getting it and recovering from it is not good enough. Okay, but and even past polio, every year when I started practicing in 1979. Every year, we took care of children who had, and some died from, Haemophilus influenza type B meningitis. They just got it. And I would tell the parents, it's so bad and so quick, by the time you feel like your child is getting sick, they're already dying. Okay, it's like, and I tell them all the time, if I take you up to the top of the AUL building and blindfold you and say, okay, I want you to just start walking, tell me when you're falling. Tell me when you start falling. It's already too late at that point. And I think that's where these diseases are. By the time you feel like you're getting sick, you're already on your way out in some cases. But after 1985, when the Haemophilus influenza vaccine came out, H-flu meningitis just went away. We don't see it anymore. I haven't seen a case of that in, 20 years. Okay, I just don't see it. But there was not a resistance to that vaccine like there is to this one. So a lot of the vaccines we've now added into childhood vaccine series, you always have your quote anti-vaxxers, okay? But on the other hand, there wasn't that resistance to it. So one of the big problems here is that we now have this massive spread of information and misinformation that's so widely disseminated that people can actually form opinions based on non-fact. Mm-hmm. And I think that's going to be our challenge going forward with not just this one, but a lot of them. They're listening to things that are just not true. And, as we make advances in things, it's going to be hard to get the advances to the speed that we should, because, people hear so much, somebody's website is big as somebody else's. They got all lies and somebody else got all truth, but they're told the same way. And I think that's going to be a major challenge going forward in teaching our children how to analyze and evaluate critical thinking because it's now not going to be past what you hear. They're going to hear it all. We now have to teach the children how to pick out what is value-based, what is not, because that's where the money's going to be. The kids are going to make those decisions and good decisions based on being taught how to think, and not not what to think, how to think. And
exactly. Speaking of spitting straight facts, I thought this would be a good time to do a quick review of the virus and the vaccine so that you too can understand some basic concepts about how it works and make your own sound decision on whether or not to vaccinate yourself and your children. So SARS-CoV-2 is the coronavirus, and COVID-19 is actually the disease that it causes. And like many viruses, it's just a little protein bubble with, in this case, a piece of viral RNA inside, which is kind of like DNA, but it's single-stranded. And then on the outside are these spike proteins, which we've all heard about, which is sort of like the viral ID card that your immune system checks at the door to see who's coming in and whether or not they need to be eliminated. And so essentially where it attaches in your body is these little receptors called ACE2, which we've all heard about, and they fit together like a key fits into a lock. And the thing is that these locks are all over our bodies. So it's in your brain, heart, kidneys, everywhere, fat, everywhere you can imagine, which is why we're seeing so many different effects in different people, permanent organ damage, and some children, which we've seen, have multi-organ failure because of inflammatory cascades. These receptors are everywhere. And so they latch on and then kind of swing inside. And then once they get inside, they sort of steal your copy machine to make their own copies, right? And so it releases all of the RNA to go to your cell, to go to your like home base and your nucleus. And now you begin making particles according to the virus's RNA instead of making things that you need for your own body according to your own DNA. And then you become a host factory where new viral particles like first exit the infected cells and then they go and infect other tissues in your body. And then eventually they come out through your breath and mucus when you spit on everybody now that you've taken your mask off and you're having a great time at the Applebee's. And how vaccines work really quickly, the same concept about the spike proteins and checking this ID card at the door. This is the basis of which we use to produce a vaccine that trains your body to remember this virus the next time that you catch it at the door, front door, trying to get in. And so essentially it's almost like, in this case, like if it's like a club and you're trying to train your body to be, to train good bouncers, you're checking the card and then your body makes matching antibodies, right? And then they send them all out to start the setup and they start attaching to the spike proteins on the outside of the virus. And then all of the cells of the assassins can come through and then see which cells have all these tags on them that were set up and then make all the kills, right? And so with the vaccines, like the Pfizer and the Moderna, these are like cheat codes. So it's like giving your cells little genetic code for pieces of the spike protein so that you can produce to make matching antibodies to fight off infection. And then we also have like the J&J and the AstraZeneca, for example, which is more like a Trojan horse, where they use like a harmless engineered experimental virus to just sneak the cheat codes inside your cells. And then you start to produce the matching antibodies to fight off infection. Same principle, it's just a different thing. And so whenever you get the vaccine injection in your arm, those muscle cells download the cheat codes, and then they all get together and throw a huge party on top of the cell. And then that's when everybody learns about COVID, they put it in the memory bank, and the next time it comes, they're getting kicked out on site. And in terms of herd immunity, what we were saying about polio and sort of how, you know, that was kind of persistent in the population for a long time. Well, COVID is new. It just jumped species and it just started infecting humans in 2019. So your immune system has never heard of COVID. Your bodies, none of our bodies had antibodies against it whatsoever, which is why it spread so quickly, along with the helpful disinformation and obstinance of the population that didn't want to listen to truth and reason. So in a crowd or a herd of people with no immunity, if one person is infected, it's really easy for everyone in that group to get infected. That's why the map is red. But when the majority of that crowd or herd that you're in is vaccinated, it's much harder for the virus to spread among that group. We're not anywhere close to being there yet. Like Doug was saying, like globally, we've only vaccinated approximately 20% of the population. But the consideration for the new guidelines that we need to keep in mind is that our communities are the ones that's vulnerable. And like Doug was saying, with vulnerable to having, outbreak clusters because so many of us are resistant to vaccination. And there's a lot of mutant variants that are still out there cooking up everywhere. And though we have some good coverage for some of them, we're still collecting data every day on whether or not the vaccines we have are effective. And we're already making headway in clinical trials to make boosters. So what's the point? Be careful, be sensible. Just because they say it's cool to do whatever, be reasonable. It's not okay for us. We should know better than that. Our communities are vulnerable. And even though a third that they say of the population has been vaccinated, the fine print that they left out was that we may or may not be successful in moving the needle with those other 2/3. We have a large contingent of conservative, QAnon, all of the conspiracy believing people who also don't want to get vaccinated. And a lot of us who are now, conflating those same conspiracy theories and believing them and espousing them to all of our people so that we all start believing it. So it's going to be important that we do that, especially if we want to feel like we're safe enough to send our kids back to school in the fall. So.
Thanks, Dr. Hudson. So, Dr. Luchey, I have a follow-up question for you related to that. So, we've talked at length about how important it is to be vigilant and to remain smart and safe, because we do want for our children to be able to safely return to school. So, if you would you just touch on the importance as it pertains to continuity in academic and social development for those children? How important is it for their development that we do what we can to support the continuity in this transition?
It's extremely important because, where I am, I'm in New York State, and, our state became very popular very quickly for the vigilance at the onstart of COVID. Our governor, really took it seriously. And at that time, many people were very grateful for that. Over time, as we've seen in many other sectors, things have lessened. Our school district is one of the very few school districts where our elementary students went back to school in September, 5 days a week. At the high school level, we actually were 2 days on, and then the other 3 days they were at home remote. So it was either Monday and Tuesday, and then Wednesday was a remote day, and then on Thursday and Friday another group of students went. But the impact of not having our students in school 5 days a week has been such that we talk about we need to get our kids back to school, but we need to understand what that's going to look like. Our students and our families need to understand, what it feels like when you walk in a building that is very different. And even though the hope is that, and it was just announced for New York State that we should, be open. But open is not going to be how it used to be. I don't like to use the word normal, and that is certainly out the door now. I don't believe, and as scientists, much better than I do. I don't think we're ever going to go back to how things used to be. And that can be a good thing. Change is good, and it's absolutely necessary. But just the impact of children walking into school. My students have said to me how hard it was. They walked in the building, they were all excited to be there, but then they couldn't hug each other. They'd get in trouble, they didn't know, is that so-and-so, because they're masked up as they should be, but so the impact on our students socially, when you have students, we have a lot of transient students, people think that, oh, well, that doesn't make sense, because there's been a hold on having to pay, for renters having to pay, their rent. That doesn't mean that people are not being evicted for other reasons. With that said, people have been moving into our district, and we have children who don't know anyone, and it makes it so much harder to interact when 6 feet apart and a mask is on. So the social impact is going to be long-standing, and we really need to not just talk about it, but talk specifically about what that looks like and what support systems are going to be put in place to support our students. Because again, we will not be going back to how things used to be, and we need to prepare our students and our families for that. The other part is that I think it was very interesting and it was very telling. Once our country realized that, kids were not going to be going back to school for some time, how easy it was for certain groups of people at certain socio or economic levels, they were able to pivot. And I'll use the word pivot with them because it was just a nice, smooth transition to, we're going to have study groups, or mothers or fathers were able to, like, they tag teams and, okay, I've got the kids Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and I'll teach them science and everything. But unfortunately for, Black, Brown, Indigenous people, that did not happen. And so the disparities in terms of education and learning, we have not even felt that impact. And it's going to be so much more than just the 1 or 2 years that we have, suffered through COVID. It's long-standing, and we have to come up with a solution.
Dr. Lucci, and to the parents who are listening, one of the concerns about our kids returning back to schools is the newness of it for some of them who have been out of school for over a year.
Yeah.
And if you juxtapose that situation with the way a lot of Black and Brown kids are treated in the school system, where there's a very heavy-handed approach to disciplinary action when it comes to those kids, I just want to make a note to parents, and maybe you can talk about this as well, to make sure that your school district has a policy about treating these kids with a little softer and more compassionate hand because of the newness of this experience for them, returning back in the fall.
That's an excellent point. I will always look at, education through the lens of an administrator and counselor. And with that said, that was one of, the issues that was, really of concern to me when we talked about opening back up, because, the push was, the kids have to be 6 feet apart. They must wear their masks. If they don't wear their mask, they have to be disciplined. And I'm like, whoa. I don't want to see a child being, suspended, or severely disciplined because, they're taking their mask off. It is traumatic for some students, to have to, wear a mask because maybe they weren't accustomed to doing that. And we need to understand that many children, particularly our children, have suffered much more because of the fact they have lost family members. There are still some people who have not directly really been impacted, but there are many others who are silently suffering. And if you don't have a relationship with that student, you don't know about that. In fact, we're starting an online, a virtual grief group for our students, because every time we turn around, when we finally make contact with the student, we're finding out that they lost a parent. But they didn't say anything just because they were just trying to push through and somehow get some of their homework assignments done. So the impact is going to be longstanding.
The trauma and the grief is real.
Yeah.
And, I know that we've, in one of the previous HoodMed chats, we've spent some time speaking with people that deal with mental health as their specialty, about how our kids are faring. And so thank you for saying that, Dr. Luchey. And I think there was a question from one of our viewers related to mental health. So, this is a great point to ask that. So the question was, are there any checkup questions we as parents can ask our kids? They mentioned that their kids have appeared to handle the pandemic reasonably well thus far. And, that could be due to being military brats, or just being able to having to adjust, to various circumstances in life. And, overall, they've been very COVID cautious since last year. And so, you know, they do have a pandemic pod where they socialize, but some of the things they might be used to doing, school, sports, and, you know, different other things throughout the year, they've been out of. So what would you say are some kind of check-in questions or touch tones we can throw out there to just to see how our kids are doing from an administrator perspective?
That's an excellent question. And that parent made a very good point. I do think that we as human beings, we don't like change, but as children of military parents, they are used to change. So this may not have as direct of an impact right now on them, but I would still strongly encourage them to check in. I have to make note that I have found so many of our honors students who are used to routine and structure. They have been tremendously impacted by COVID and the remote learning, the virtual learning, the 2 days on, 2 days, virtual instruction. It's been very difficult for them because many of them aren't used to having to have structure because they're naturally gifted. So they haven't had to employ like time management and study skills like they have to do now. In terms of, what kind of check-in, I have a son, my one and only. He graduated last year. And I really had to put on my parenting skills. And it was really hard to watch him struggle through the switch. And he's 19. He had plans on going on to college and doing some things. And last minute, and I'm so glad he had the courage to say so, he didn't want to do it virtually. And so it's very important to check in with your kids. I say regularly. And then, there are times that I'm like, okay, I give him his space. But then there's other times that I'm like, nope, we got to sit down. We got to talk. How are you feeling? What are you feeling? As parents, we want to have all the answers. Our kids are used to us having all the answers. I will never forget, it was about 3 weeks before his graduation when he's a realist, he was putting 2 and 2 together. And I was still, with faith and hope, like, okay, we're going to somehow figure this out and we're going to be able to have graduation. And when he asked me a couple of questions and I couldn't answer, like when this was going to be over, I'll never forget the look in his eye when he turned around and he said, but Mom, you always have the answer. And I had to tell him, honey, I'm sorry. This is so much bigger than me and many other people. I don't have the answer. Checking in with students or your children, finding ways so that they can continue to socially connect with their peers, give them their space, but also sometimes you gotta, tug at them and kind of force them to interact, with you, either individually or as a family, because this has allowed a lot of students to close themselves off. In fact, just in the Western New York area, it was announced that, in New York City, I don't know if you saw it on the news, they announced that all schools will be fully open in the fall without remote instruction. However, in Western New York, there are several school districts, Buffalo Public Schools being one, that has agreed to having, they'll be open, but they will also afford some students who desire to stay at home and learn remotely to have that opportunity. So, there's a vast array of options as it is now, but, we also know that anything can change at any time. So it's important for us to, just be transparent, I think, also with our children and share with them how we're feeling, what our thoughts are, our frustration. And at the end of the day, ultimately, focus on what you can control, even if it's something small, instead of worrying about what you can't control.
Amen to that. Amen to that. Dr. Yancey, what do parents need to know about the safety and efficacy of the vaccine? How do you advise parents in your practice to help them understand the risk of not getting vaccinated and helping to ease their fears and hesitancy?
Go with when I'm talking to parents about the vaccine, I like to go with many times asking them a couple of questions about which of the I'll list a number of diseases and ask them which of them have they seen, okay, and they'll say I haven't seen that, And I said, have you ever heard? And they'll say, well, I don't think I want these vaccines. I said, have you ever heard of epiglottitis? And they'll say, no. So, well, that's because it's caused by something called Haemophilus influenza type B. And in 1985, we got a vaccine for that. So have you ever heard of, and I'll name another one. No, that's right. You don't see it anymore because of the vaccine for this, that, and the other. So I try to get the fact that vaccines, that concept has been around a long time. But then they say to me, yeah, but they rushed this through too fast. Okay, so I will then go to a number of things have changed, and that is technology has changed. And the fact is, it's not rushed through too fast. All the trials were exactly the same. But then I meticulously explain how the red tape was removed, okay, in that you don't have to now, if I come up with an idea for a vaccine, I'd have to say, well, let me see if I can find a disease that's worth researching, okay? We didn't have to look for a disease that was worth researching. We got one, okay? Then I have to say, okay, it's gonna cost me so many hundreds of millions of dollars to put this together. Let me get my investment group together and see if I can start sending out notices to see if I can find people who may want to invest in this vaccine after I explain this disease to them. So that may take a year and a half, 2 years, just to get your investment group together to be able to invest in the vaccine. But that didn't have to happen. The government says, we got a problem here, you got the money, okay? So that's where so now you cut off 2 years off the beginning of that. You then say, I got to see if I can explain this disease to people, and so I can get people who want to get in my clinical trials. We had a ready pool of people who said, I want to be in the clinical trial, okay? So a lot of those things were just red tape that were cut off from the beginning and later cut off from the end. When no company's going to go out and invest, millions and millions of dollars in the equipment to mass produce a vaccine if you don't know if it's going to be approved. Government comes in and says, you just make the equipment, and if it doesn't get approved, you don't lose Willie to cost. Company goes, hey, I like that. So these are all things that added to the length of time from conception to administration of a vaccine that didn't have to happen with the COVID vaccine. So I try to explain to my parents, it didn't get rushed through. It's just a lot of the red tape was cut off. Instead of having one researcher work for 8 hours a day on a particular project, the researcher says, I'm going to work on this project with you. I'm going to put mine aside. So now we have 100 researchers working 8 hours a day on that project. And so you can cut the time down with that. So as technology has changed, as we pivoted in an emergency situation to get this done, that's how the time could be sped up. So sometimes I get some, I'll explain it that way. The other thing though, some of the real hesitancy has come in what they've also heard and read. And one of the things that they heard and read, especially for when you get down to younger kids and adolescents, is that it affects fertility, okay? And so that's another big one that has come up. And I have to explain then, or I will be explaining, have to explain, that whole concept of somebody saying that affected fertility was based on something that wasn't true. There's a particular protein that tends to, coat the placenta, and complex names. Some people say syncytin, some people say syncytin, whatever. But there's a vague similarity to the way the spike protein looks on the coronavirus. So then somebody said, well, if that protein kind of looks like the other one, and you come up with antibodies against the spike protein, you're probably going to have antibodies against this one that coats the placenta and can't carry babies to term. Well, like social media, that gets started and people say, they suddenly then jump to, oh, it affects fertility. Well, and I have to then break down how that's really not the case, but inadvertently that's already been tested. How? Because if you make this antibody to the spike protein, like you would even if you got a natural infection, we didn't see this mass decrease of all the millions of people infected, we didn't see this mass decrease in childbearing or birth rate. And so that just didn't happen. So I explained that one. So then everything that comes up that gets blown out there, we're headline readers many times and don't get into the meat of it. There's always something frightening out there. I think the other thing I've had to explain many times to parents, that there's a difference between something being closely associated, in other words, timeliness associated with it, and actually causing it. Okay, and what I usually use is I tell my parents, I believe that Pampers cause brain cancer. Okay, and they look at me and they say, well, that's the most ridiculous thing I ever heard. I said, but you're right. But if you go back and look at it, okay, if we look at all the kids who aged 2 to 5 who had brain cancer, like 99% of them wore Pampers. Okay, and they go like, that's ridiculous. And I go like, I know. That's right. It is ridiculous. So you can't. So even though they were associated in time, they wore Pampers and they got brain cancer. But there's no there's no connection, because then what you have to do is go back and find all the kids who got brain cancer who didn't wear Pampers, or all the kids who wore Pampers and didn't get brain cancer. So I work on trying to explain the difference between an association and a cause. And so when I work on those kind of things and try to get them to see that, I have some success in that. The other thing that I've had to be, when I talk to a lot of young people, I won't accept, I just don't want it. Okay, I'll say, we got to talk about your vaccine. So this 14 or 15 goes, I just don't want it. And I go like, that's not gonna work. You have to tell me why you said that. And so I just don't. And so I think that there, I then make them tell me, what did you hear? What did you see? What did you read? What did your friends say? You have to tell me why you said that, because we're gonna sit here for a while, because I'm not gonna accept, I just don't want it, okay? And so, because I want them to be critical thinkers of what they hear. And I think we're gonna have to start that in much lower grades, because I think just because I don't want it, we have to stop accepting that as an answer from young people. And so if we can get the parents on the level of, of some of the concepts of temporal association, but not cause, and the children, we stop accepting because I just don't want it. Okay, then we're going to see if we can kind of move some people toward that. So I'm hoping to get better buy-in in the future. Let's face it, this is not going to be the last pandemic. Okay, this ain't going to be the last one. I wish it was, but it's not going to be the last one. So when the next thing comes along, we got to have a better response to that, and that response has got to be from children who have learned how to think. And I think that's one of the things that I try to come up with.
I absolutely love that critical thinking piece. I love it. I don't even know how else to say that and then the educational piece, because I think that, it's in the midst of all of the information and the misinformation and the good information that comes our way, it's easy to take the easy way out, the lazy way out, and just to say, I'm just not gonna be bothered, and to challenge ourselves to think critically and answer why, I think is one of the keys to progress in that regard. And related to that, there, you spoke a little bit about the difference between a causal relationship and, an association that just so happens to be related by time. There was an announcement that came out over the weekend, and I think it also coincides with one of the questions that came from one of our viewers in this particular HoodMed chat. Stephanie asked about her 14-year-old who has one shot already, which, Stephanie, that's awesome. I commend you for doing that. That is amazing. And that's what I hope we will all do for our children. So his second shot is on deck, but she's concerned because of that recent announcement over the weekend related to myocarditis in young males following vaccination, and wanted to know what she should look out for. So could you kind of just put that in perspective for us, and how that fits in with what you were saying about things just so happening, it just so happens that these things might be related in time, but it doesn't mean that they are causally related.
Well, first thing one of the things you have to look at is you have to come up with a mechanism as to how that could be the case. Okay, and so there's no mechanism by how that could be the case. So let's look at myocarditis, and I'm talking about 4, 5, 6 years ago. It started to come across in pediatric literature at that point that we need to kind of start looking out for myocarditis, because there are a number of kids who would get these viral infections, and they would be a little sick, and they'd be a little sicker than usual, and they had trouble getting back to athletics and stuff like that. And so it was an entity that was missed a huge part of the time. I mean, and many times they would just go on and recover and get back to it. Nobody ever thought of myocarditis. So they were indicating that the incidence is probably much higher than we thought. Okay, so we put that aside there. So before pandemic, anything before 2019, we were, quote, missing the cases of myocarditis. Now you take something like the vaccine, and you say, now we're going to meticulously watch for everything that goes on with this child after getting this shot, okay? So we get the shot, and now we watch everything. So now every fever suddenly means something. Every time they don't feel good, it means something. And we meticulously look at that. We're going to find some of the cases of myocarditis that we never looked for before, okay? So we're going to find that temporally related to the shot. So when they get the shot, and okay, well, let's look at all this. So kids were getting fever and not feeling well in the whole bit. Yeah, tons of them have myocarditis. We just didn't know it. But now we're looking for everything involved with that. And so people say, oh my goodness, he got the shot 2 weeks ago, and now he's got myocarditis, okay? Right, because we're looking for that now. Not because the shot caused it necessarily, but we're looking for it. And so that particular reaction triggered us to look further for something. And that's what we're looking at. So I think that's the case. The other thing you have to look at is you'd have to look at, okay, then the incidence of this has to have meaning significantly higher in the groups that got the shot as opposed to the groups that didn't. Okay, and so far that's not panning out because a bunch of kids still have myocarditis. The incidence is still there, and these kids never got the shot in the first place. So no, there's no mechanism for it. You can't really show that there's really a higher level of it. And now we're meticulously looking for everything. And that's why you're going to see some of these things show up in a timely relationship to the shot, because they were there, they were going to be there anyway. And so, but the good part of that is we're looking for everything.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. The point of what you're saying, we're looking for everything. We're watching in real time how stringent this process is.
Absolutely.
How much oversight there is. They're catching every single incidence in millions.
Right. The chances of catching a side effect. Let's look at the J&J. Okay, Johnson & Johnson vaccine. We'll get these shots.
Actually, I have a really go ahead.
The chances of finding something that happens 1 in a million times is next to nothing, which shows you what kind of care we're taking to look for everything related to this. And with all that looking for that, it's still safe. Okay, so, and I'm gonna bounce back to something else, totally unrelated but political. Okay,
do it.
How clean must President Obama's record have been? Because for 8 years they looked for everything.
That's a good point.
So how clean did his record have to be? Because they looked for everything and couldn't find nothing. Okay.
Yeah.
So now with the vaccine, we're looking at the Pfizer and Moderna, and they look for everything, and it's still safe. Okay. The other thing I'll throw in, and I'll be quite active. Let me just throw this in, is that nothing at all is 100% without any risk. Okay. When I shut off my computer tonight, walk to my door, go to my elevator to get to my car, there is a risk involved there. There's a risk of somebody being there with a stick to knock me in the head. There's a risk of me falling down the elevator. There's risk in every single thing we do. Every breath we take, there is a risk involved in it. But what we have to do, we have to look at benefit, everything, benefit versus risk, okay? All of us probably, unless you're fasting, probably ate lunch today, okay? You did not see every morsel of that food prepared by somebody. There is a risk that something that you ate today could kill you, okay? But on the other hand, if you don't eat anything, you're gonna die. And so I think when we get down to that couple of things, what is completely 100% safe? Nothing. What is safe enough? Tons of things. And that's what we have to look at. So
including all the cheeseburgers, all of the everything.
But I can tell you this.
Don't make no sense.
I can tell you COVID's not safe by any means. So what we have to do, we have to look at those and weigh those back and forth. And that's what I try to convince the parents with.
Dr. Yancey, when I was a kid, parents used to say, don't go outside in the cold without a coat because you're gonna get sick, you're gonna catch a cold. And we grew up believing that if you're outside and you're exposed, you automatically catch a cold. But we know as scientists that cold is a virus that you don't just catch because you're outside in the cold, you catch it because you were susceptible and around the cold virus. So while being out in the cold may cause your body to be more susceptible to catching the cold virus, being out in the cold itself does not give you a cold.
Right.
And it's the same type of situation here. Just because you had the vaccine doesn't mean the vaccine caused this ailment. You have to be aware of what you said earlier, the causal, relationship versus the association relationship.
Right. One of the best ones ever, and one that everybody knows about, and millions of people still believe in, is the association between teething and everything everybody thinks it causes, okay? And teething is occurring at the same time as the natural immunity, transplacental immunity is falling. So the kids catch all these little viruses and stuff. So they get this fever and it's always teething. Or you get this fever, when teething basically causes one thing, teeth, okay? And so therefore, but at the same time, the antibody levels are falling that the mother conferred on the child through the placenta. And so at the same time they're getting teeth, they're catching all these other things that people think it causes that. And so that's one of the I always like to point to and say, this is not related. It's a time related, but not causally related. So absolutely.
Totally. Dr. Luchey, I want to get back to this whole question of getting back to school, even though it's going to look different for every single kid in every single school system. But can you give us a little bit more insight on how school admins are talking about helping to bridge that gap? Are we looking at summer school? Are there things that, we can do? What is that next year going to look like academically? Are we going to help kids catch up? Or is the state testing still going to be, emphasized? Or how are we going to deal with it?
Those are excellent questions. As we literally just within the last, 2 weeks, came to the realization that within our district, we were not going to be able to open full-time 5 days a week. Because within the Western New York area, for example, many of the school districts have been able to either willingly or some of them were sued by parents and forced to open 5 days a week. However, our district, because we didn't have enough supplies for other reasons, we were not able to open 5 days a week. So once we have closed the door on that, now we're looking at, what the end of the year is going to look like. The federal government forged ahead with, assessments, statewide, assessments are still, upon us for our students. So we need to get through the end of the year with prom, with graduation, which of course is going to look different. It's going to look different as it has in the past. It's going to look different than it did last year, thankfully, because we've been able to open up more and the social distancing is not as extreme. With that said, then the next conversation is summer school. What is that going to look like? Are we going to be able to offer it in person and or virtually? And then the next step after that is, what is this next school year going to look like? And unfortunately, we're not, and I'm using the word step, but actually many of these discussions will be taking place concurrently because, there's a lot of discussion, you need to have all parties, community stakeholders involved in much of the decision making. So in terms of, concrete answers, again, there's a lot of uncertainty. There will be summer school, at least in my district. We have not shared out or come up with, the plan that's been shared yet. Moving on to next school year, conversation has not been formally had with the community in terms of, will we be 5 days a week and that's it? Or will we also be offering, virtual or remote instruction for those, students who would like that? So there's a lot, that's still up in the air. And as you all know, if, our youth do not continue forging ahead with, getting vaccinated, by the end of the summer, things could look very differently. So we just have to, again, focus on what we can control, but also plan ahead and be flexible. I think that's the one of the many lessons out of this terrible pandemic is being flexible.
Totally. Doug, I think I want to throw it back to you and have you kind of walk us through a little bit more detail about the guidelines. Some of you may or may not know, but Doug actually is, his alias is the Black Epi. He's new part of our sort of science communications group. And so his whole aim in life is connecting the dots. So I'm going to throw it over to him.
Sure. And I'll say a little bit about this. And this is all related to the recent CDC revisions to social distancing and vaccination guidelines, which I'm sure you've all seen. And I should say that these pertain to, people that are fully vaccinated. And there has been a lot of confusion, but the highlights are that fully vaccinated people can congregate, whether you're outside or inside, without your mask, right? This is what the recommendation was, and that you can go back to what your normal routine was pre-COVID, right? And that's based on it's based on science, right? A couple of studies that were shared with the general public, one out of Israel and a couple that looked at data from across the United States and focused on what healthcare providers, first responders that are fully vaccinated, and looked at the rates at which they contracted COVID. And the results were pretty promising, right? The results showed that, these folks that are vaccinated really aren't coming down with COVID like as we would hope, and they're probably not spreading it the way that we were afraid they might. And that's good news. It's related to the what we call the viral load, the amount of virus in your body, and the vaccines are doing a good job of keeping those loads low. But there's some caveats here, right? And they're pretty big caveats. The first of which is that this is subject to change, right? There are a lot of variants out there that their whole goal is to escape all the work we've done to outsmart the virus. They want to outsmart us. And so those variants could do a good job of escaping immunity, right? And that's outdoing the work that so many people have put into making these vaccines protect us and give us the immunity that will keep us safe from severe COVID. There's that piece, and also the fact that depending on the setting, right? If you're in public transportation, if you're in New York and you're trying to, you're trying to get on a train, or you're in Boston, you're taking the T, or in Atlanta and you're on the MARTA, or in Indiana and you're hopping on Indigo, right? And if you're on public transportation, the recommendation is still that you wear your mask, right? And so there are some of these conflicts that might be confusing to people. And then there's, on top of those, there's the fact that in communities of color, Black and brown communities, we've been disproportionately affected by COVID, right? When it comes to deaths, hospitalizations, and cases. And that means that we have to be extra careful. And so while the rate of vaccinations in our communities is going up, it's going up at a pretty lower rate than it needs to be to keep up with everyone else. And that should be concerning, right? Because we don't want to relax all these guidelines and restrictions too soon and then take backward steps, right? We're rolling a boulder up a hill. We don't want to release the pressure and then have that boulder roll back down on us and crush us as we're trying to get the relief that we were seeking. And so those are important considerations, in all of this. And I think I mentioned this earlier, and that's why my personal recommendation is that just keep your mask on. Right? Regardless of if you're vaccinated or not, your kids aren't vaccinated, right? And, we want to be examples for them too, right? I have a 5-year-old son, and if I'm not wearing my mask in public, he's going to look at me sideways. Dada, I thought I'm not in school because of COVID, right? And, what do I say to him to make him understand, right, why I wouldn't be wearing a mask in public when he's not yet vaccinated? And I'm using those justifications to take off my mask. The pieces just don't all fit together smoothly. And I think that's why it makes sense for us just to be cautious, just be consistent across the board. I'm not gonna take my mask off, and I'm gonna make sure my son wears his mask, regardless of where we are about. And so that's my spiel on the more recent guidelines. And if you haven't yet gotten your vaccination, none of this applies to you. Okay, my recommendation to you is go get your vaccination and keep your mask on until you do, and probably a little on after that too. So we got to work together. We're not don't get me for saying this, but one of my favorite movies, kind of blaxploitation movies was Drumline, right? And one of the key mantras from that movie was one band, one sound, right? If one of us looks or sounds bad, we all look and sound bad. If one of us is late, we're all late, right? You can't do this by yourself. That's why they call it public health, okay? And we got to look out for each other. So, hope that makes sense.
That was amazing. And Dr. Yancey, are there any, did you have something else, Doug?
Well, I did, on that note, just to wrap up, Dr. Yancey, are there any special instructions you would give to parents looking to register their kids for a vaccination? Right? We know parents need to find a site that administers the Pfizer vaccine because that's the one that's been approved for teens as of now. But are there any other directions or considerations you would throw their way in terms of signing the kids up?
Real quickly, I'll just say, I guess my age is showing here because you mentioned blaxploitation movies and Drumline.
No, I thought he was going to go back to the 70s. I was like, Drumline? I was talking about Nick Cannon?
Not that far. Not that far.
Through the hard way and stuff like that, so, I mean, Freddie's Dead just came to my mind, so that tells me how old I am. But anyway, what I would say, the biggest caution is, yes, make sure that the site you register for, don't waste your time. Make sure the site you register for has the Pfizer vaccine. I've had a number of parents who said, "Oh man, I took off work, but they didn't have it." So my biggest thing was go online, because you will not find this in most of the pediatricians' offices because we just can't do it. By the time you pop the cork on that first one, you got just a short amount of time to get rid of every dose in there. And I don't have a $40,000, 50 below zero freezer or anything like that. So find the site, but make sure that you verify that the site has the Pfizer before you go. And that would be the biggest thing. So don't waste your time going where you can't get the shot.
Dr. Yancey, you also wouldn't suggest that parents should plan out their vaccination schedule if kids have to get other vaccines for school, correct?
That was just, they can get them, that was just taken off the table about last week.
Okay,
because it had to be before. It was like you had to have 2 weeks before. You couldn't get it 2 weeks before or 2 weeks after. But they just took them off, and you can even get them the same day now.
Okay.
So but that's just as of last week. So that's hot off the presses. So yeah, I think what you can do is that personally, and this is not, I kind of still like spacing them out, because if you get that fever afterwards, it's kind of like which one it was.
Yeah.
So I still kind of like that. But if it came down to where you couldn't get it and you had to get it like the same day or whatever, you still can do that.
Sounds great.
That's an excellent question, because I was wondering about that. If you could do, the vaccination, the COVID vaccination, along with other vaccines. So thank you. I have to spread that good nugget.
Yes, hot off the presses.
Hot off the press. Thank you, Dr. Yancey.
No problem.
This is usually time where we offer you all the opportunity to impart any last comments or advice to our viewers. So Dr. Luchey, do you want to go first?
Oh, wow. Certainly. Yes, I think it's so important, as we talked about it before, just touching base regularly with your children, not taking no for an answer. Open those closed doors at times. I mean, as they become, teenagers and young adults, they want their privacy, but, I'm old school. As long as it's my house, my rules, and, it's important. And you got to instill those rules while they're young, because it's a lot harder to make those changes as they, already established their routines of having closed doors. But closed doors also lead to closed communication. And like I said, sometimes, it's important to force the conversation and just say, listen, we must have this conversation. I need to know how you're doing. The whole mental health piece, we as a people, we need to embrace mental health. It is equally as important as physical health. And we're going to see for a long time coming the direct impact that this pandemic has on mental health, not just for our adults, but also for our children. So that's another reason why it's so important to check in with them. And then, utilizing your resources. As adults, we have to get over that stigma, that shame, that embarrassment that you or your child may need to talk to somebody. You would be amazed at how many, people reach out to me on a regular basis. And actually, as I say, I'm against using the word norm, because normal is really more so just the opposite. And there are many, many people who, are in need. So let's just make it a point of keeping up with our mental health as much as we do with our physical health.
Amen. Dr. Yancey?
Yes, I'd like to just want to say that for our children, I think our parents need to realize you are their bridge to good health. You are their that they're not going to be able to find the things that keep them healthy unless you find it for them. So I would encourage the parents to seek out the individuals who you feel have the good information. Please go one step further. Don't just say, I don't want it. Ask yourself why, and then have someone explain that. And not to be on, a fear mongerer, but I will say in some situations, you only get one chance to be wrong. Okay. And so that is something that I use a lot, that once your child comes down with the deadly disease, it is devastating to know that it's a great possibility you could have prevented it. Yeah. Okay. And that came from years ago with a little lady, a little patient I had, and a lady who had brought a little baby in, and she wouldn't get the pertussis vaccine. Like a few months later, the child got whooping cough. He was in the hospital for 32 days. Okay, coughed his head off for 32 days. She came to me and she said, Dr. Yancey, if you ever have a parent who doesn't want the shot, please send them to me, because really and truly, you only get one chance to be wrong. And so that's and I think that's what we were looking at here. This thing is devastating. Let's as parents seek out the good information. We're the only branch, the only bridge to our children's health.
Yeah, amen. I want to thank you, you all, Dr. Lucci and Dr. Yancey, for being with us. We really appreciate it. I want to thank everybody for tuning in to this important Hood Med Chat discussion. At Hood Medicine, we want to bring you trusted individuals to provide you with all the facts and information to allow you to make the decisions necessary to keep you and your family safe. Please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to support our effort, donate to our cause, or find out about our next events. Visit hoodmedicine.org, at hood_medicine on Instagram or Twitter, and Hood Medicine Initiative, all one word, on Facebook. Thank you again. Stay safe, get vaccinated, and continue to be masked up. Thank you, guys.